When picturing Egypt, most Westerners think of the pharaohs, pyramids, and mummies of old, relics of the past that still do exist in the modern country of Egypt, yet their national identity today has been heavily altered. And yes, of course, the pyramids and other fragments of ancient Egypt are an integral part of Egyptian history and culture in a sense, but due to migration and conquest, their language, genetics, traditions, and customs have been permanently altered. Homo sapiens have been living in Egypt for at least 40,000 years, and as I've mentioned many times, the indigenous people of North Africa have a quite unique gene pool, although obviously North Africans didn't just spring out of the ground. The North African component, described as native to Egypt and the Maghreb, is a combination of many different ancestries, but predominantly ancient Middle Easterners who intermixed with sub-Saharan Africans and Europeans over thousands of years, which is why indigenous North Africans are genetically connected to all three of the aforementioned regions, yet are predominantly Southwest Eurasian racially speaking, with admixture rates depending on the country, region, and ethnic group. The first known ethno-linguistic groups to have inhabited North Africa belong to the Afro-Asiatic family, most likely originating somewhere in East or Northeast Africa, spreading out to the Horn of Africa, Egypt, the Maghreb, Arabia, the Levant, Iraq, and eventually even West Africa, and the haplogroup most heavily associated with Afro-Asiatic peoples is E3b, dominating North Africa and the Horn. Horn Africans are similar to North Africans, although they have a sub-Saharan African base that has evolved into its own unique genetic cluster due to the fusion of African and Eurasian ancestry, and in historical anthropology, North Africans, including Egyptians, and Horn Africans were both considered to be a part of the Hamitic branch of the Caucasian race, the other two being Semites and Japhethites. The ancient Egyptians, meaning those inhabiting the land since at least 3000 BC, spoke the Afro-Asiatic-based Egyptian language, which although related, is nothing like modern Arabic, Hebrew, or Syriac, belonging to its own distinct branch, and to the south of Egypt had always been the Cushitic peoples and the Nubian kingdom of Kush. Egypt and Kush, centered on the Lower and Upper Nile respectively, went to war with each other for centuries, with Egypt conquering Kush and vice versa before being conquered by the Syriac Babylonians and the Achaemenid or Persian Empire, later to be incorporated when Alexander the Great defeated the entirety of the Persian Empire. However, even before this, Egypt had a long history tied to Phoenicia and modern Lebanon, and especially the Greeks, who had settled all along the eastern Mediterranean, and a huge chunk of the Egyptian population was already familiar with the Greeks and the Greek language. So after the collapse of Alexander's empire following his death, a Greek dynasty was established in Egypt by Ptolemy. The Ptolemaic dynasty lasted for over 3 centuries, with Cleopatra being the last ruler before being conquered once again by the Romans, later becoming one of the empire's most wealthy, influential, and densely populated provinces. In the later period of the Roman Empire, Christianity took a strong hold in the Egyptian province, being one of the first fully Christianized regions in the world, and hence was one of the strongholds of the Church in the Byzantine Empire. However, was also one of the first Byzantine regions to fall to the Arabs following their expansion in the 7th century AD. This conquest, much like that in the Levant, fundamentally changed the people and culture of this area forever, as a large portion of the conquered Egyptians, at this point known as the Coptic Christians, were converted to Islam and assimilated into the Islamic world, although it wasn't for a few hundred years after this conquest that the Egyptian Muslims began to speak Arabic as a first language rather than Coptic, which is essentially the only living descendant of the Old Egyptian language, written in a unique Greek-based script. Unlike other areas of the Middle East and North Africa that were conquered by Arabs, Egypt actually remained majority Christian for many hundreds of years after its invasion, being at least 50% Christian until around 1200 or 1300 AD, well after the fall of the Byzantine Empire in the region, and subsequent conquest by the Turks, Franks, British, and French greatly influenced the emerging Egyptian culture as well as the Egyptian-Arabian base established after the Islamic expansion. By the 18th century, the Coptic language had finally died out among the Christian community as well, although they still identified as Coptic Egyptians, in contrast to the Muslims who identified more with other Arabic-speaking countries. However, it wasn't until the Arab nationalist movements of the 19th century that Muslim Egyptians really started to call themselves Arabs, despite having spoken Arabic and only Arabic for nearly 1,000 years, which really confused me until I compared it to a similar situation in the British Isles, wherein the traditionally Celtic regions of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales gradually took English as a native language after their incorporation into the UK, although even to this day, almost all still identify as ethnically Celtic rather than English. Throughout the generations, Egyptian Arabic-speaking Muslims would have heavily intermarried with the incoming Arabs, although Coptic Christians did not, as the vast majority of children born in an interfaith marriage would have been raised Muslim, and hence, despite speaking Arabic for generations, living in a majority Arab country, and having a similar culture to other Arabs, the vast majority of Copts don't consider themselves Arab, and most are opposed to the concepts of pan-Islamism, pan-Arabism, and the like. Another parallel to this would be the Arabic-speaking Catholic Maronites of Lebanon, originally of Syriac origin, losing their Syriac language some time ago, and Copts also assimilated many other Orthodox Christian groups in Egypt over the centuries, including Greeks, Armenians, or Assyrians. I have seen some sources claim that Coptic Christians still make up around 20 or 25% of the population, and some sources claim that they're only 5% or less. Obviously huge disparities, but by compiling as many sources as possible, I found the median to be somewhere in the ballpark of 8 to 15%, most likely currently sitting around 12%. So although the Muslim and Christian Egyptians have diverged significantly from a genetic standpoint and have admixture from other groups that came after them, they still both have the blood of the old original Egyptians forming the base of their ancestry, even if it is higher in some more isolated communities than others. In fact, some studies have actually claimed that modern Persians have been more genetically impacted by the Arab invasions than Egypt was, which is very debatable to say the least. But what is clear is that the vast majority of Muslim Egyptians do have varying degrees of ancestry from the Arabian Peninsula, with a few exceptions, which we'll get to later. Studies on paternal haplogroups have found that a plurality, 47% of Egyptian Muslims belong to haplogroup E3b, native to North African populations, but 28, 8, and 4% belong to haplogroups J, R, and G respectively, meaning almost an equivalent percentage of paternal ancestry is recently derived from Southwest Asia. So therefore, Egypt is intermediate between the Arabic-speaking Libyans or Tunisians, and this is true for the dialects spoken as well, sometimes being considered a part of North Africa and the Middle East, with the latter definitely having a more fluid definition. The North African country with the highest degree of genetic similarity to Europe is Algeria, which makes sense considering an extensive history of settlement by Romans and Germanic tribes such as the Goths and Vandals, while on the other hand, the country with the highest degree of original North African genetic makeup is definitely Morocco, meaning even though a majority of Moroccans speak Arabic today, they were the least affected genetically by the Arab expansion, and is a topic I'll revisit in the future. Other ethnic groups native to Egypt that may have been partially Arabized but don't necessarily identify as such include the Siwa, located around the Siwa Oasis near the Egyptian-Libyan border, the westernmost surviving Berber group, the Beja, the northernmost Cushitic people, inhabiting mostly the Red Sea coast, and the Nubians, a Nilo-Saharan people who are the remnants of the Kingdom of Kush, located mostly in southern Egypt and northern Sudan. Both these latter two groups were Christian prior to the Arab conquest, similarly to the Egyptians, and intermixing did occur between the natives and the arriving Arabian conquerors, so that they have significant Middle Eastern admixture, possibly even more than some other North African groups. And in southern Egypt and Sudan, the lines between Arab, Nubian, and Beja are becoming increasingly blurred, with some communities being nearly indistinguishable from an outsider's perspective. Sudanese are obviously far more mixed than the Egyptians, having genetic connections to North Africa, the Middle East, the neighboring Horn of Africa, and of course the indigenous Nilo-Saharan peoples that now inhabit South Sudan and other parts of East Africa. And similar to other mixed regions, genetics and appearance is incredibly variable and is dependent on the region of the country, socioeconomic status, and a variety of other factors. The modern sub-Saharan African component for the average Sudanese Arab is around 40 to 60%, while in Egypt it's somewhere closer to 10 to 25%, which is actually about the same as the Southwest Asian Arabic-speaking country of Yemen, as Yemen is incredibly close to the Horn of Africa and has had a long history of trade, migration, and intermixing between the two regions. Non-indigenous ethnicities in Egypt include a moderate community of gypsies of South Asian origin known as the Dom, the ancient cousins of the Rom or Romani now living in Anatolia and southeastern Europe, as well as a large population of people of Turkish origin who are mostly the descendants of Turkish families and officials who arrived during Ottoman rule, with El Arish on the Sinai Peninsula having an especially large Turkish-descended population. Some sources have even claimed that as high as a fifth of the Egyptian population may have some degree of Turkish ancestry from the Ottoman colonial period, which sounds insane, but if we use lenient enough definitions, such as when we discovered that 20% of Latin Americans have at least 5% Sephardi Jewish DNA, this sounds like it could be much more plausible. From the 18th century until quite recently, there was also formerly a large expatriate population of Europeans, either foreign or Egyptian-born in the cities in northern Egypt, mostly of Italian, Greek, Maltese, or British origin, although nearly all of these communities have left following recent political turmoil in the country. So the country of Egypt today, officially the Arab Republic of Egypt, has been greatly transformed by the Arab expansion, and they have an extremely rich history connected to many other parts of the world. So please let me know your thoughts on the ancient and modern Egyptians, and for today's poll, let me know whether you think Egyptians are Middle Eastern Arabs or not. And as always, thank you all so much for watching. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.